Welcome to the Design Podcast from the Methodist Church, conversations on living life to the full. In this edition of the podcast, I'm really pleased to be joined by David Flavell, who is a Methodist minister and author of The Love Feast, which is published by Kevin Mayhew Limited. Firstly, David, welcome.
Thank you.
As a Methodist minister, you clearly at one stage felt a call to the ministry. Why Methodist ministry? What's distinctive from Methodism as opposed to being a Baptist pastor or a Church of England priest? What's distinctive about Methodism as a brand, do you think?
I think Methodism has an evangelical heart and a social conscience, and I think the two go together. And I think Methodism also has a great pragmatism and are willing to do whatever it takes to win people to Christ. And I think that's the heart of Wesley's approach.
So it's essentially the evangelism, the desire
yes.
to win souls in old
language. That's what Wesley wanted, and
yes.
That's what our task is today.
And what do you think the shape of the church is today? How do you feel the church is living out that calling in contemporary society? A lot has changed since Wesley.
A lot has changed, but I think Wesley's methods still work, and Methodism is a dynamic disciple-making organisation today. The only problem is that the Methodist Church of Great Britain lacks a great deal of the Methodist ethos and Methodist style. So we've actually become sort of second-class Anglicans almost in the way we do things. And we've lost that Methodist edge, which works, and I assert still works today. Some of the things that Methodism is famous for is things like open-air work. And most Methodist churches today spend less time in the open air than churches in North Korea. You know, we're in an invisible church. And it doesn't have to be preaching on the street as a ranter, although there's nothing wrong with that. But we find that things like having an open-air service at the bandstand, or doing a questionnaire in the marketplace, or having carols in the square at Christmas, things like that, actually getting us out of the building, make an impact, and get people to see us. And you get all sorts of conversations in the street with people that you don't do when you're inside. So open-air work is a key part of Methodism. That'd be one thing I'd say. Another key part of Methodism is contemporary music. When Wesley was around, he used contemporary music to start his revival. And every revival since has used the latest music. He didn't use hymns from years ago. His 1780 hymn book had 525 hymns in, 12 of which were by dead people. Now, when you compare that with Singing the Faith, our super new resource, we've got more Isaac Watts hymns in this new one than Wesley did. And every great revival has had new hymns and new music, and it works today. And they say Methodism was born in song. Well, it's dying by hymns. And you can't have a revival, and you can't bring people to the kingdom when you're singing old-fashioned hymns, which have words which make no sense and which don't work today. So I would assert that we want to be truly Methodist, we wouldn't sing Charles Wesley hymns.
Golly, that's quite a radical thing for a Methodist minister to say, really.
It is. Well, if you think about it, we're losing 10,000 members a year. If we were a football team, there'd be people outside singing, chanting, sack the board. If we were a hospital, we'd have been closed down. If we were a school, we'd be in special measures. How could we possibly do worse? We may as well give it a go.
Well, let's talk for a minute about how we've got... Let's go back a stage. You say we've kind of lost some of perhaps the heart of what Methodism is about, what it means to be a Methodist. How do you think that has occurred? I mean, is it just it's so long since the church kind of came into being through the Wesleys that simply times have changed and we've grown and evolved, or is there something kind of fundamental shift that you feel has happened to distance us from that?
I think it's a fundamental shift, and it's inevitable. I think Wesley saw it himself. It's the idea that in the Lancashire mill towns you have the phrase clogs to clogs in 3 generations, where the first person gets the mill and comes from nothing and is a great entrepreneur. The second person inherits the mill and runs it, and the third person's been sent to public school and wastes all the money on gambling and loses the entire fortune. And in the same way, the first generation love the gospel, the second generation assumes the gospel, and the third generation forgets the gospel. So Methodism is actually a really great social accelerator for those who've got any get up and go. And what that means is that individuals who've got get up and go, as they're born into Methodism, use it as a way of improving themselves and going up through the classes, and then through the generations they forget the original zeal. Great example of that is in Carver Street in Sheffield, which is now closed, but which is an enormous gallery chapel. The masters sat downstairs, the servants sat upstairs, and when it came to communion, the servants had to leave to go and prepare the master's food for lunch. And those people were the descendants of the riffraff, which Wesley preached to, who'd made their way up in society. So it's very quick that you can lose your missionary zeal. And Wesley himself noted that, and he wrote about it and said, the revival contains the seeds of its own death within it. So what's happened is Methodism has become more and more middle class. Methodism has forgotten its roots. Methodism has aspired to be better. And that is why we've come to the situation we're in today.
But you talk about Methodism becoming more middle class. Surely any brand of Christianity, any denomination should be classless, in a sense. It doesn't matter whether you're middle class.
It should be. And Methodism, like the Ritz, is open to all. However, if you're not the right sort of person, then what happens is you come into church and people go, single mother, don't think much of her, or children running around making a fuss. And actually, we should be open to all, and we say we're open to all, but we're not really. And the way that we have closed doors is not by having physically closed doors, but by having assumptions about the people who come in and the way they are. I mean, going back to the hymns, why don't you know the hymns? These people don't know can't find it in the hymn book. These people don't seem to know where it is. They're singing the wrong words. They're not joining in. What's wrong with them? And that's the attitude, and that's the thing that needs to change. We need to be so desperate to get people, we'll do whatever it takes.
But how do you say desperate to get people to bring people to faith in Christ? How do you do that without compromising the gospel, without compromising core values?
I think the more you emphasise core values and the more you emphasise the gospel, the more people will come. It's one of the paradoxes that if you have a church which says we're open to all and you can believe what you like if you come, people say, well, if you can believe what you like, I'll stay at home and have bacon sandwich and read a newspaper. If you've got a church which says this is where we stand, if you want to come with us, that's fine. This is what we're about, but we're not going to change our values. Then people flock to that. And churches which stand for something are growing.
And you talked about passion for the gospel and losing the missionary zeal. The gospel, of course, is interpreted afresh for each generation and can speak different things to each generation. How do you think the gospel is relevant today in new ways, in perhaps ways that it didn't speak in the same way, for example, when Wesley was preaching the gospel? How are we experiencing the gospel today?
I think we can experience the gospel today in new communities, like online, and that's a way that Wesley would never have thought of, but he would have embraced with open arms. He would have said that it was of the devil and absolutely inappropriate and completely terrible, and then he'd have set up his own website and carried on with it. So we can do it that way, and people's needs haven't changed. In fact, in some ways, there's more needs than ever these days. There's debt, there's drugs, there's gambling, there's alcohol, there's all kinds of different problems people can have, which Wesley would never have come across, and people's needs are the same, and the gospel can still respond to that. The use of new technology, church has always been at the forefront of new technology, except if you go to a typical Methodist church today, you still have books. Who reads books these days? You have a speaker who speaks for 20 minutes without PowerPoint or without visuals. Who listens to a lecture for that long these days? It's completely out of the culture, whereas Wesley would be on the website, he'd be on the blogs, he'd be arguing in chat rooms, the world would be his parish. He'd be on Twitter, he'd be on everything. He would be using every method he could, because at the heart of Methodism is this pragmatic view of divine providence, and Wesley always saw it as divine providence as the way he was going, as did the even more successful primitive Methodists who came after him, Hugh Bourne and William Clowes. Their view together was that God would lead and they would follow. And we have a system where we just do the old thing over and over again, which doesn't work, and we keep expecting it to work, and it's not going to. Whereas Wesley would say, well, forget that, let's try this.
So on one hand, you're saying we need to retain the heart of Methodism, what it means to be Methodist. On the other hand, we need to move with the times, be relevant, be contemporary. If you were redesigning church, you talk about wanting to get rid of hymn books. If you were totally redesigning church to be authentically Methodist but contemporary, how would you do it?
I think you'd have your meeting place, you'd have a giant screen, you'd have your preacher come on and talk, you'd have a band playing different kinds of music, but basically adult-orientated rock is that's not my favourite. My favourite's gospel music, but we don't have a big gospel music demographic in Hexham, I'm afraid, in Northumberland. But I'd have that sort of music, I'd have that band, I'd have small groups, because small groups are essential at the heart of Methodism. And I can't understand why every Methodist church doesn't do Alpha or Christianity or any of the different ones, because it's not a question of theological bias, because there are so many different Alpha clones that you can get one to suit your theology. And why aren't you reaching out to people in that way? Every church should have a website. This is 2011. If you haven't got a website, you're almost saying our doors are shut and we're not interested in other people. I'd have lots of exciting things happening during the week. I'd have lots of children's activities, because children and youth work is absolutely key. And in my lifetime, the Methodist Church's children's work has declined 91% in my short lifetime, which is appalling and disastrous. And I'd have lots of children's activities and holiday clubs and things like that. And you can still have your model of church where you have people meeting together to worship God. It's just you don't have the old-fashioned things that get in the way. And in Wesleyton's, the reason why Wesley rode a horse everywhere is because he didn't have a car. And it's not a question of what kind of horse can we have and how can we have a better horse, and can we have a horse on wheels, or do we need a horse at all? It's we just want to get from A to B. Let's have a simple, straightforward car to get there. Problem solved. Go on public transport if you're feeling green. And similarly with church, it's not a question of changing it completely. It's just a question of using modern communication methods so that people today can hear in a way they can't hear, these and thous, and here I lay my Ebenezer. And organs. Organs are the death of music. Wesley didn't use an organ.
I do know a few organists who would contest that point.
Do they have growing churches?
Well, some of them do. But I think what we need to explore here is, if you're saying, we should go with contemporary worship all the way, then of course you do leave people behind, don't you? You leave people behind for whom actually hymn books and traditional worship really does feed their spirituality, really does help them connect with God.
I'm not sure that's true, because if it really did feed their spirituality, they'd be out there inviting all their friends to come to worship.
Perhaps they are.
Well, I see no evidence of that, because when I ask them who's invited somebody to worship this week, they don't put their hands up. And when I ask them, well, why not, they just shrug their shoulders. And if they are, they're highly ineffective at it. So either they're not doing it or they're not very good at it. So if they're being fed spiritually by these hymns and this kind of worship, where's the evidence of it? We'd expect to see growing Christians, we'd expect to see disciples being made, we'd expect to see lives being changed, we'd expect to see people coming forward to be preachers and ministers. There's no evidence that people actually like the music with the hymns. They complain about it like Billy-O when you change it, but what's the point of providing worship for people where they say it's feeding them, allegedly, but there is no evidence of it?
But there's a danger there, isn't there, that you turn being a Christian into a kind of how good a Christian can I be kind of competition. How many people can I invite to church? How many, good deeds can I do? Are we in danger there of turning it into an exercise of deeds rather than faith?
I don't think it's salvation by works. Spurgeon said every Christian is either a missionary or an imposter. And my theology, my idea is that God has done so much for me, why would I want to keep it quiet? And if you're looking for a classic Wesley hymn about that, Wesley talked about my every sacred moment spent, Charles Wesley, my every sacred moment spent in publishing The Sinner's Friend. Now, if we sing that, are we singing it because we mean it or because we enjoy a good sing? Now, if you want to sing it and mean it, I think that's great. But if you want to sing it and not do it, I have a major problem with that, because why are we singing hymns about evangelism and going out and changing the world? How can I keep this within my heart, says Charles in his conversion hymn. If we're not going to do that, why do you want to sing hymns about it?
That's a huge challenge, isn't it? I mean, I think we've talked a lot about Wesley and we've talked a lot about church. We haven't talked very much about Jesus.
Okay.
So we've mentioned the gospel, but we've not talked about Jesus. What kind of Jesus do you think the church should be following today?
I think we follow a robust Jesus, a Jesus who tells it as it is, who sees us as we are and who loves us just the same, and not a wishy-washy Jesus. If Jesus was producing statements for the Methodist Church, I don't think he'd make many of the ones that come out, which are on the one hand this, on the other hand that. Jesus was very direct, very clear. He told people there was a cost to following him, and if they didn't want to follow him, then they should turn away, and many did. We, as the Methodist Church of Great Britain, have a Jesus who says, well, it's all right, whatever you like. If you want to come along and join us, that's nice. If you don't, well, that's okay. Whereas I think the real Jesus is far more challenging, far more threatening, and far more scary than the Methodist Church offers.
So we have a scary Jesus setting the example.
We do. We have a Jesus who is an amazing person and an amazing God who is far more we can understand and imagine. Every time we think we've got a grip of Jesus, we read something else in the Gospels and his story moves on. And the Jesus I follow is a Jesus who's very challenging indeed and expects me as his disciple to be perfect, and expects me as his disciple to tell others about him, and expects me as his disciple to follow him to his cross. Now, those are not the actions of a wishy-washy Jesus who isn't that bothered. These are a Jesus who it's really worth following, but it's not easy. And I think that as the Methodist Church and as the church as a whole and as Christians, he is the Jesus, the real Jesus, who we should be proclaiming. And our problem is that we pull back and we don't.
But that's quite hard to proclaim the Jesus who expects us to be perfect, isn't it?
It is hard to proclaim it, but that's the preacher's job. And the preacher's job is not to say, oh, it's easy following Jesus, sign up if you want to. The preacher's job is to say, follow Jesus and it'll take you to the cross, but it'll be worth it. And that is the task we have. And it's a very difficult task. And in human terms, it's impossible. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to empty yourself and give up everything to follow this Jesus? But in divine terms, it's the only life worth living.
But if the average Methodist said to you, well, if Jesus expects me to be perfect, I know he's only going to be disappointed. Why bother starting? What would you say?
I'd say we believe in Christian perfection as Methodists, and we believe that although our sin is absolutely awful, the power of the Holy Spirit is even greater. So we can achieve perfection, and we can achieve that state where we no longer sin. And that's what Wesley believed, that's what I believe. And I think that if we say, oh, well, I'm not going to make it, therefore I won't bother, that's a complete and utter cop-out.
Well, it's a huge challenge. Thank you so much for your time, David. We have run out of time. If you're listening and you want to find more podcasts, you can go to the Methodist website, which is www.methodist.org.uk. David, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.